Thank you and welcome to our May session of BusinessWise Insiders. As I mentioned, the presentation will last 20 or 25 minutes, after which we'll split into breakout rooms where you'll have a chance to introduce yourself, ask questions, and share your own thoughts on today's topic with some of our wise guys as well as the other attendees. You can always ask questions in the chat window, and if we don't get to it during the presentation, we'll be sure to touch on it in the breakout rooms. So today, as Deborah mentioned, we're going to revisit the status of cold calling in the current B2B environment and take a closer look at cold call strategies that sales reps can use to engage prospects and set first-time appointments over the phone. And specifically, we'll take a look at scripts that you can use to navigate the various phases of your cold calls and successfully start conversations and set appointments. But first, let's just take a minute to look at why, in the world of automated email prospecting sequences and social media, sales reps should still pick up the phone and dial hundreds of strangers with the goal of setting a couple of appointments. I'm sure almost everyone here has heard or read something about how cold calling is dead, or that it doesn't work, or that it only works when you warm up a prospect using other methods. And in that environment, you can't blame sales reps for asking questions like, is cold calling worth my time? Do the results justify the investment? Will prospects take my calls? Everyone screens their calls, nobody picks up, so why bother? Aren't other channels better and easier? Email, social media, networking, referrals all seem to be working better, so why pick up the phone to begin with? And then critically, does cold calling still really work? Is it an outdated approach to B2B business development here in 2023? But instead of searching for reasons not to cold call, which is an easy thing to do, let's look at some very good reasons to continue cold calling. First, cold calling is direct. Unlike email and social selling, cold calling is what we call synchronous. You interact with your prospect in real time, as opposed to an asynchronous back and forth as with email. So cold calling offers the shortest potential path to a conversation with a prospect, and that alone makes it worth the effort. Cold calling is also far more human than other prospecting channels, which allows sales reps to play to one of their biggest strengths, which is your interpersonal skills. And that brings us to the third point, which is really important. Cold calling itself builds confidence and combats fear. Successful sales requires human interactions, often uncomfortable ones. And if you limit yourself to the comfort of asynchronous prospecting methods, you'll never build the confidence you need to offer honest advice to your prospects or clients, to tell them things that they need to hear but may not want to. And then fourth, and most importantly, just like every other prospecting technique, it's true that cold calling is destined to fail if you're doing it the wrong way, or if you don't do it at all. But if you do it right, it can work just as well or better than other methods, especially in certain situations. Okay, so what does all of that mean for cold call scripts? What is the right way to cold call? Well, let's start by looking at what we're really doing when we're cold calling and what we're trying to accomplish. First, we're calling a stranger and probably interrupting them. Second, we're engaging in a two-way conversation with that person that could go in any number of directions. And then finally, we're looking to create a path to a longer, more in-depth conversation about problems, priorities, ideas, and solutions. And all of that is happening in the space of a few minutes tops. So the best cold calling scripts are going to be flexible and situational, preparing you to react to whatever brush off, objection, or question the prospect throws at you. They're going to need to be confident and conversational. Even the best scripts will deliver mediocre results without frequent practice and role play. And they need to be consistent with your style and personality, which are critical to your individual approach to building rapport with a prospect. So as we examine the various scripts in today's presentation, try to keep these principles in mind. Ultimately, your goal is not to be spoon-fed a cold call script that someone else says is the best script ever, but instead to find the scripts that best equip you to be a confident and successful phone prospector. Before we dig in, Deborah, did you want to offer any introductory remarks?
Only that I couldn't agree more with what you just said, Sam. And I think one of the most important things that we tend not to do is to practice, and that is critical.
Right, and we're not going to focus too much on practice techniques in this presentation. We really want to focus on scripts that you can use and ideas that you can take back to develop, what you say in a cold call. But we definitely talk about it often in other insiders presentations, and I would encourage you to keep an eye out for a future presentation on sort of the new rules of cold calling, where we'll get into a little bit more of what you can do to practice your scripts to be confident in conversation. Okay, so that brings us to our first script, which we call the voicemail email combo. And the fact that we're starting here is probably a good indicator of how cold calling has changed in recent months and years. You can no longer think about cold calling without also thinking about how to reach your prospects when they don't answer the phone. That's one of the advantages and challenges of a landscape where the buyer-seller interaction is mostly remote. There are more than one way to reach your prospect, and you can use those various methods to complement each other. And since it's long been a fact that the vast majority of calls, about 80%, go to voicemail, it's critical to have a voicemail strategy that includes a well-rehearsed message and a plan for follow-up. And here's just one example of a short and sweet voice message that you can leave. Now, the important things to keep in mind here are that, to contradict what I just said, you should have a rigid script when it comes to voicemail, rigid in the sense that you know exactly what you're going to say when you get someone's voicemail. It's the one area where there's really no excuse not to nail it every time, since you're just reciting words into the phone. And just a note here that if you do have a voicemail script that you like to use and you're comfortable sharing it, please think about doing so in the breakout room at the end of the presentation. That would be a great way to exchange ideas on this point. And then secondly, use your voicemail to set up your next move. So in this case, a follow-up email to your prospect with additional information. And as you can see, the voice message at the top doesn't include a phone number. That's because the odds that your prospect will actually call you back are pretty slim. So we've chosen to focus our energy on setting up that next step. So here's another example of the same tactic where the sales rep explicitly states that there's no need for a return phone call, and where he mentions the subject line of the email that he's about to send. Again, the goal here is the same: to use voicemail to warm up an email, but with a slightly different way of doing that. And here at the end, he mentions that he's going to call back next week if he hasn't heard back, which sort of sets up that next step in the cadence. So again, the point here is using voicemail to prompt a follow-up step, maybe two follow-up steps, in a way that warms those steps up and that you can refer back to when you reach out in the future. Now, of course, not every voicemail has to set up an email follow-up. You can also go for the callback, but in order to succeed, you'll need to be crystal clear about the value your prospect will receive in return for replying and engaging. So a couple of points specific to this approach: it's better to tell your prospect you'll call them back rather than asking them to call you back. It's not their job to return your call, so you probably shouldn't ask. However, if you give them a good reason to call, they might. So be sure to include your phone number. And then finally, if you say you'll call back, you should do it. Follow-up is a good way of showing that you're committed to doing what you say. And then as far as why these strategies work, the first point to make is that a voice message that's clear, concise, and direct is more likely to resonate with your prospect. They're more likely to listen, understand, and remember, and therefore to respond. Secondly, whenever you offer something of value, it gives your prospect a reason to engage, even if it never goes any further, which is all you're asking them to do at this point anyway. You're aiming for a conversation, not a sale. And then finally, following up on your voicemail with an email and another callback uses those multiple channels and touches to amplify your message, which only increases the odds that your message will be heard. Deborah, anything to add here on voicemail?
When was the last time you left your voicemail message to yourself and listened to how it sounded? Please do so when you're evaluating how good your voicemail message is.
That's a good point. And actually, one thing that I've heard repeated a couple of times is that both with scripts on the phone and in a voicemail, if you sit up and even smile when you're delivering the message, it comes across as more energetic and confident. So even reading the same script in different ways can change the odds of somebody hearing it and calling back. Okay, so now let's get into the scripts that you can use when you actually get a prospect on the phone. And your first mission is to get past hello, to avoid getting shut down in those first 30 seconds. So this is a script we've used at BusinessWise for a number of years. We call it the double handshake because it's a two-pronged introduction. And the first prong is to establish that you haven't met and to ask permission to continue speaking. So if you get a yes, then that's all you need. There's no need for that second prong and you can dive right into the phone call. But if your prospect says no, then you can move on to the second prong, which is to ask if there's a better time today for you to connect. So this is a simple permission-based approach. And the reason it works is that asking permission gives your prospect a chance to open the door to the conversation. And if your prospect is the one giving you permission, then it's much more likely that the conversation will be congenial. And then the reason for establishing that you haven't met is to remove any potential friction that might stand in the way of a conversation. You want your prospect to focus on and respond to what you're saying and not be distracted trying to remember whether they know you or your company. And then finally, the second prong of this double handshake where you ask, is there another time today, applies a sort of gentle pressure on your prospect and conveys a sense of urgency. It makes it a little harder for him or her to brush you off. And often your prospect will just agree to talk now rather than trying to find a time later in the day. Here's another example of a permission-based opener, and this is from Jason Bay of the sales coaching organization Outbound Squad. And he starts from the premise that he's likely interrupting the prospect, so it's best to be upfront about that fact. And then he's very explicit about his initial request. So he says, I know I'm probably catching you in the middle of something. Do you have 30 seconds for me to tell you why I'm calling? And you can tell me if you want to keep chatting. So he's asking the prospect if he can tell him why he's calling, and then being clear that it's entirely up to the prospect whether he wants to continue. So it's a direct approach, and one that is probably pretty hard to say no to after you've answered the phone. And then since we're taking a look at different kinds of approaches you can use, I wanted to include an example that goes against some of what I just said as food for thought. And it's something we can certainly discuss later in the breakout sessions. As I mentioned, our classic double handshake script intentionally leaves out mention of your company to reduce friction and increase prospect focus. And the idea is partly to get your prospect to ask questions, since when they do, they'll be more likely to listen to the answers. But it's not for everybody. So here's an alternative approach from one of our favorite sources of sales knowledge, Anthony Iannarino of the Sales Blog. And he writes, the first thing you should do is to tell your client who you are, your company's name, and why you're on the phone. And his main points are keep things short, no more than 20 seconds, be professional and credible. Introducing yourself and your organization clearly makes your call more credible. And then personalize. We're using cold call scripts, but there should be places in your script to mention your prospective client and their business by name in that situation. And some prospects do chafe at the idea of being asked if they have time to speak when they have no information about you or what you want, which is why some reps avoid permission-based openers altogether and jump right into the reason for their call. And I would encourage you to think about and even try both approaches just to see what feels right for you and what works. Deborah, anything here on introductory scripts?
One of the most challenging things about trying different approaches is that the number of conversations that we have certainly are reduced. It's going to take us someplace between 8 and 12 dials if you're calling a particular decision maker to actually have a conversation. And again, that's why it's good to practice with people both within your company and folks that aren't in your company to get feedback of how these scripts sound.
Thanks, Deb. Okay, so for our third script, we use the acronym TRICK, which stands for the reason I'm calling. And at this point in the call, your prospect is starting to wonder what you're calling about, what you want from him or her, and it's the sort of what's this about phase of the call. And the idea behind TRICK is twofold. Number one, it helps you remember to be direct and get to the point. And number two, it ensures your call has a purpose that both you and your prospect are clear on. So here I've offered a couple of different ways to continue the sentence. The reason I'm calling is to ask if you're open to, is to set a time to meet, is to show you some ideas about, and then pivoting to, do you have your calendar in front of you? And really aiming for that appointment. And the ideas here are really to show you that the reason you're calling is not to talk about your product and the features and benefits that you offer, but to give the prospect a reason to engage in terms of what matters to them. So you're going to want to brainstorm with your colleagues about what that reason should be. What is your goal? Is it to set an appointment? Is it to discover if there's a reason to connect at all, to qualify your prospect? Is it just to offer something of value to pave the way for future interactions? And at the cold call stage, you have to assume your prospect isn't close to thinking about buying anything. So you have to ask yourself, what do they get from a meeting or a conversation with you, even if they don't buy anything, even if it never goes any further? Why should they give you their valuable time? And then use that premise to craft a compelling reason for the call. So your goal is to get your prospect, in many ways, to ask you a clarifying question like, who are you, or what's this about? And when they ask, they'll be more likely to listen to the answer. So you'll need to be ready with something that's clear, concise, and unique, and that speaks to your prospect's challenges and priorities. So here's an example of some what we do statements that we might use here at BusinessWise. Use pain words whenever possible, things like concerns, confusion, frustration, and focus on your prospect's problems and challenges. And remember, value propositions that you used previously might be irrelevant or outdated in today's landscape. So take the opportunity to think hard about ways you can make the reason I'm calling into something that helps your prospect in today's economy. Of course, the other key after each of these pain points is that the prospect must also be open to change and improvement or a better path forward. And emphasizing that fact can put pressure on your prospect to decide between improvement on the one hand and the less than ideal status quo on the other. And then once again, here's an alternative from Jason Bay. As a way to avoid talking about features and benefits, Jason encourages a who, what, why, who, what, how approach, where you talk about what you do through the lens of somebody you've helped. So when somebody asks, what do you guys do? You say, great question. A VP of sales I work with at a company called Company was in a situation where insert problem and where they wanted to achieve goal. They used my help to achieve solution. So I'm curious, what are you doing to address that problem? And the question at the end is critical to move the conversation forward, but it doesn't have to be the one that Jason suggests here. It can be more oriented toward setting the appointment. Something like, if that's on your radar, can we get 30 minutes on your calendar to look at how that approach might work for you guys? So again, identify your objectives and modify your script accordingly. Deborah, anything you want to add here?
Got it, Sam.
Great. So let's move on to the next phase of the call, which we lump our next scripts into the category of, let me ask you something. Because no matter what you say is the reason for your call, and no matter how good your what we do statement might be, your prospect is likely to resist, and the key to driving conversation forward is through questions or bridging statements. So this set of scripts really gets at the idea of how successful sales reps deliver value that gives prospects a reason to do anything, to take your call, set the appointment, take the next step, buy your product. Prospects resist because they aren't looking at problems and priorities in the right ways, and they're worried you're going to waste their time. Questions can open their eyes. So here are 6 different ways of responding to everything's fine right now, or we don't have that problem, that might move the conversation forward. And that indicate that you know something that your prospect might not know that can help them shift their perspective. So if X isn't a problem right now, I bet you're facing Y. Can I show you why that matters? That probably means you're doing a good job at X. Is that right? You can, of course, also share intelligence about competitors and insights. Your competitors have adapted in these ways. Have you thought about that? Will you keep the same approach over the next 12 to 18 months when X, Y, and Z will likely happen? And then reframing the conversation. Here are 5 problem areas I'm seeing in the industry. Which one would you take off your plate if you could? Or does that mean you're not looking to accomplish X, Y, and Z? Now, each of these questions obviously is tailored to a specific type of resistance your prospect might offer. If they say, I don't have a problem, you can use question 1. If they say, we're happy with the way things are going, you can use question 2. So no matter how a prospect resists, there's always a question you can ask that keeps the conversation moving, alters your prospect's perspective, and focuses on the insights that you bring to the table. And the key points here are that you know your prospect will object and resist and attempt to brush you off. You know how they will object. So prepare and be ready with the right question. Second, when your prospect resists, the cold call is in a bad spot. So to move it to a good spot, you need to move the conversation forward, have that bridging statement to more familiar, fertile ground. Questions are a way to do that because they elicit responses, which lead to more questions and so on. And then finally, listen. There's a 70-30 rule that you may have heard about. As a rule of thumb, aim to spend at least 70% of your time listening and no more than 30% talking, because when your prospects talk, the focus is on the things that they care about rather than on your product or service. Anything here, Deb?
You just alluded to being you-oriented, and I think the most important thing is that we think about what it is that might be on our prospect's mind versus what we want, which is to set an appointment and tell them how great we are. That tends not to work. So the more we can focus on what our prospects are thinking about, we can become that trusted advisor that all of us want to be, which means that our prospects need to trust us and we need to have advice that's worthwhile.
That's exactly right. And so much of the stuff we've talked about today already, when you're talking about the reason for your call, or when you're thinking about why your prospect should buy from you, or when they ask you, what do you do? Or when they resist, the immediate impulse is to say, because we have this great product. And scripts are a really key way to bridge the like I said, the gap between the point in the conversation where you want to talk features and benefits to one where you're talking about what your prospect cares about. And not only finding the right scripts, but again, practicing them, because the most successful sales reps are going to be the ones that pivot the most successfully, effectively, and quickly from that one bad point in the conversation to the good point. Okay, so finally, we just wanted to offer a few last resort scripts for when your cold call is on the verge of fizzling out. So the first one is called the 369 question, and I'll say at the outset that this isn't for everyone. It's a little bit lighthearted and creative, but it's a good illustration of a principle that you can use to rescue a conversation and pivot to follow-up. So the idea here is, at the end of the call, to say something like, I understand you don't want to meet right now. Let me ask you 3, 6, or 9. And when your prospect says, what do you mean? You say, when should I follow up, in 3, 6, or 9? The idea here is to let your prospect define the time frame in terms of follow-up. So it could be 3 days, it could be 3 weeks, it could be months, but you never know which your prospect will be comfortable with. And if you define it rather than they, you might end up setting a plan for follow-up that lasts longer than what your prospect would define. And so here's a more direct way of asking that same question. Apparently, I can't help you at the moment. Since things can change quickly, I'd like to stay in touch, but don't want to bother you. When do you suggest I connect with you again? And the point here is to give direction to the conversation. So even if it might be ending for now, you can set up an opportunity for later follow-up. Keep that flame alive. And then letting your prospect define the time frame is similar to asking permission at the beginning of the call. When he or she sets the terms, that engagement is likely to be more congenial and productive, as opposed to if you just keep hammering away, even if they haven't invited you to call back. And then finally, it's important to note that this kind of last resort question is really only for qualified prospects. You obviously don't want to follow up with a prospect that you determine is not a good fit for you during the course of your call. And then one thing I like about this approach is, if your prospect agrees to follow up, you have an opportunity to ask one more question, and that's what might change between now and then. And that can oftentimes elicit an answer that keeps the conversation going for now and maybe even leads to an opportunity for an appointment. Deborah, any thoughts on these last resort questions, whether they work and what's important about them?
What's important is to remember to do it. And I often hear when people call me, this last moment to try and sell something. Well, if anything happens and you really want to do business, or it's a throwaway and it leaves a bad taste in people's mouth.
Thanks, Deb. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. So before we go into the breakout rooms, I just want to say thanks again for taking time this morning. I hope you got some good ideas that you can take away from it, and hope you join us next month. We're on the second Tuesday of every month. Of course, we'll send an invitation. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we will start the breakout rooms. So thanks again.